Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, GitLab. My name is Christopher Lefholtz, and this is the development group conversation. Today is October 4th, 2022. As always, you can look in the invite to see a link to the agenda. Currently, we have one question in there listed and the pre-video for people to view associated with this group conversation. And the first question is actually a reverse ask, not for folks to verbalize, but if they want to put in context or put in their vote. This time around, I didn't get a chance to update to add additional content slides for the group conversation. I just used the key review slides. If you have been part of previous key review or part of previous group conversations and appreciate the additional context, let me know, because it does take a little bit of extra effort. And just want to see if that's valuable to people. If it is, then I'll continue to do it. But if it isn't, then it's a good example where we need to always be constantly thinking about what we trim for efficiency versus what we do in given situations. Cool. And John Coughlin has the first question. John, do you want to verbalize your question?
Sure, thanks, Leif. I saw a mention in slide 5 around things we're considering for fiscal year 24. One of them is hire for company and not specific positions. Curious how that would work in practice and whether that's something you've seen be successful elsewhere in GitLab or in other companies.
I have seen this successful in other companies. I don't know if I could articulate a time or place where it was successful at GitLab, though you could argue that GitLab hires and we have a lot of lateral movement associated with it, particularly in the development department. As an example, I think in the last year we've had 20% internal hires. That means where people have moved between different positions within different groups associated with that. Now, the one thing I say is when I say hire for company, I could be more specific there. I could say hire for role. So as an example, if you're a backend engineer who has a specialized skill set in, say, Rails development, as an example, there are actually a number of places that you could work within the product itself. So that's kind of the thinking here is like we target more for that type of position, and then we do that. Some companies take this to an extreme. An example is I'm trying to remember who it was. Is ZipRecruiter. ZipRecruiter literally does not hire any software engineer into a specific team. They hire them in to the company, and then they get assigned where each manager has to do a pitch associated with it. I have definitely seen companies that have been successful with this. We have to figure out how we would actually make it work in our practice for our specific team, given our current hiring practices. But the idea is that you effectively can have a more efficient front-end pipeline associated with hiring that person. Though, the downside of that is that they don't know which specific team they may be working with, which in general, if you're looking at people earlier in their career, that may not be as much of an issue for them. Later in the career, there's definitely a role, an opportunity where people want to make sure they're getting into the right team and those aspects. But that's kind of the way we're thinking about it here. And obviously, this would be something we'd work with TA, talent acquisition on how to figure out like what that process consists of and how we would best do this. So the exact details it would be yet to be worked through that process. Or let's say the next quarter, with the intent of trying to roll this out in late Q4, early Q1, associated with getting hiring moving there. Does that give you an idea, John?
Yeah, it does. Thanks. Yeah, I started my career in finance, and when I joined the investment bank, I was part of a class, and we kind of spent like the first 60 days meeting with the different teams, and then we're placed after. So this is something I'm somewhat familiar with from my own experience, but cool to see we're considering at GitLab and as a potential solution to some of the challenges around hiring.
Yeah, and we're at the volume now for development where it's kind of it can lead to some better efficiencies for both talent acquisition as well as our own department in this particular situation. Though the downside of that is obviously there's other efficiencies that we might lose out on. As an example, specific domain experience that maybe helps an employee get a leg up initially, and other considerations like that. So obviously there's going to be some trade-offs there that we have to make. I'm going to give it a few more minutes just to see if there's other questions.
Actually, I wanted to
Maybe
add a
I
little
can
bit to this
vocalize one.
conversation.
Go ahead.
In particular, for distribution as an example, and as we try to expand the specific technologies that we have experience with within the team, and just having more people to be able to do the work in the first place. We're one of those teams where it actually is really hard to have a generic kind of position, and we're actually needing to try and hire out of the industry for exact and specific expertise. So this is something that we're dealing with right now. We had a candidate come through, and great candidate, had exactly what we needed to be able to hit the ground running, other than onboarding them into GitLab and a few of the ways that we work. And just they're under such demand that by the time we get them selected, they're elsewhere already. We wish that we could bring in either interns or even juniors at times and just get them trained up, but the train up time takes like 9 months to a year, and sometimes we need to find very domain specific knowledge that's not applicable outside of our team.
Yeah, so a couple options for your team, in particular, Jason. In distribution, I'm kind of well aware of the kind of unique both requirements as well as kind of the other aspects. One, it doesn't necessarily gravitate towards that polling option for that because of that specific domain experience, particularly if you want somebody to hit the ground running. To your point, so like that's definitely a case where, like, when I made that comment earlier, I would definitely not say we're going to do that for all positions, right? We'll still have some that are kind of unique for that aspect. You do bring up another good point, though, kind of like I'll break it up into two pieces. So that's kind of like part one of that. Part two is the opposite of that, which is, well, if we feel like we have people who might be capable of doing this, but we have to give them more time to learn, that's the other way we can potentially relax here is we've been definitely focused on efficiency. Do we consider this as an example where, maybe we bring somebody in with a less direct domain experience, but we also have an expectation that, we have a little bit more of a relaxed timeline. That does put an additional burden on the team, though. That's where I'd want to make sure that, everybody in the distribution team is comfortable with that in regards to that. And it's one area where I think we could potentially experiment to see, and I think we're going to have to start doing that. That's where potentially bringing back in kind of an associate or entry level role is kind of a consideration, because that's like a lot of times what we would look for, somebody who has the basic skills but doesn't necessarily have domain, but is also earlier in their career where they're interested in learning that for that specific experience. That's kind of the thinking there.
Right, and this is actually, you're calling that one out particularly, is our team, we look for the expertise, but if we don't necessarily see that, we also look counter for the interest. Do we who have the expertise recognize traits in how they're curious, how they approach problems? Do they have the skill set to be able to develop that series of expertise that we're looking for? So we do also look for that. And we have hired for that in the past, and those candidates have turned out exceptional. So we're not going, hey, you need 15 years of Excel 2020. We're not doing that. We're very explicitly looking, do you have the skills that we need right now and you can expand into the other roles that our team has? Or do you have related knowledge that you can use as correlative and drive your interest into the tool sets that you're going to be working?
So you're already kind of doing it a little bit already. I'm even maybe trying to broaden it even more for that experience. But yeah, now, like I said, one thing I want to be careful of is if you get too broad, then of course you run into the opposite problem, which is the team gets burdened down with training everybody who's on being onboarded, right? So there's a balance there that we have to kind of pick.
Exactly, and this is one of the driving factors behind distribution starting to do separation of duties, or separation of specific interests is the way we like to phrase it here. Why we've got build and we've got deploy, and we're still looking to do operate for next year to try and have people that can come in, work in a specific team, and as they develop skill sets and they want to change what their focus are, then they can do that.
Cool. I think that's all the comments I see on that particular item. Torsten, you have the next question.
Yeah, it's more out of curiosity. So on the merge rate topic, you mentioned that we will be spending some time on these visiting grants, and there will be a negative effect on the MR rate. And I wonder if we have any data or stories from other industries how there is a positive impact of such social events on the MR rate or productivity in general that we could be taking into account here.
Yeah, I think if I interpret you the way your question is kind of like, hey, like if morale goes down, eventually it's going to impact productivity. Kind of that's kind of the way of saying it. And to be very clear, like we should be doing these things. Like I don't want to imply otherwise. Like I definitely fully.
I didn't think so. Yeah.
I definitely fully support visiting grants. I was extremely disappointed that we canceled Contribute. But I understand the reasoning. Like totally support the reasoning, but still disappointed. And I'm glad to see that we're doing things that effectively make it happen. In fact, I was trying to figure out a way to get up in my local area. It's local by distance by about 5 hours driving time, an hour flight to Dallas, Texas, to do one. Unfortunately, it just doesn't work out logistically for me because of other commitments I have. But upshot of it is I don't know how to quantify this very well. There's engagement. We look at Culture Amp results. Our Culture Amp results overall have been fairly positive relative to the industry. For my department in particular, it's really tough to get above average because we're the largest department. So like when you compare it relative to the company, as well as relative to the department, as well as to the function, we're about half the size of the function, and not quarter anymore, but a little bit less than quarter size of the company. So when you look at it from that perspective, it's hard to get above average in some regards to company performance. But like when we compare it to the industry, we're doing very well in general in our engagement scores related to Culture Amp. So that's one thing that we look at, but that's only a survey that we do once a year that's kind of evaluated a particular time of the year as opposed to overall engagement. Quantifying it beyond that is a little bit harder. So that's where it's interesting. Sometimes this discussion gets, sometimes like you'll see us use kind of looks like extremely quantified numbers. And then other times you'll see more like kind of social information. And it's a little bit kind of like economics. The people who are working in are aware of what's being influenced, and consequently, because of that, they know how to react to it in some way. So like, is it the actual thing you're doing, or is it just the fact that you're trying something that gets people to potentially try things differently or change behavior? It's a little bit less scientific than that.
We would need to have another GitLab that doesn't do the social events, but everything exactly the same, and then we could say this is the impact.
It's actually a super hard software development problem. That's like back in the old days, 70s and 80s, they were trying to do it where they were trying to like, okay, what's really like, here best practice. Best practice is only the best practice as long as it's best implemented. Usually best practices that are poorly implemented are actually worse practices, as an example. So like that's kind of a interesting aspect to it. So I don't have a good quantification otherwise than just the fact of, we're trying to make sure that if people feel like they're getting demotivated, it's a conversation I would definitely encourage you to have with, your manager, your manager's manager, me, and kind of like, let's like have an opportunity to kind of talk about, like how we might change the environment to better influence that.
Thanks a lot. Thanks.
No problem. Jason, you can verbalize what you're writing. There's no reason to feel like you don't
Yeah.
have.
I was just gonna make a kind of a side comment. No, but the one thing that I can tell you from our group and our engineering experience, whether it's doing the work or interacting or how we choose to implement things, people like to say, well, it's best practice. Okay, prove to me it's actually best, first off. And second, standard does not mean it should be standard. There's oftentimes, as you said, if best practice is not implemented correctly, then it's actually really bad. If it's a standard practice, did anybody ever bother to make sure it was a best practice? Because the two things are not interlinked. And if you don't believe me, look at 50% of all containers on Docker. Okay? Most of them are really, really bad, even if it's standard.
Yes, I won't disagree with you. I think we actually, as an organization, we've been pretty flexible. We don't have too many common standards across the organization. We give teams a lot of flexibility. The one thing that I would say is you do still have to pick a few things to kind of like hang together on. Otherwise, it's, I hate to say it's complete chaos, but everything becomes a snowflake and it becomes a hard discussion of like particularly when you're looking at it from a higher vantage point, how things are going, right? Because everybody's going to have their special answer in that situation. And I've worked in organizations that have been like that, where it's been actually extremely chaotic and unproductive, particularly when two teams work directly using, in quotes, best practices. They're directly opposite of each other, and then they have to work together for some reason, right? As an example. So I think personally, I feel like we give a lot of flexibility to teams. So hopefully people feel like that's the case. But just understand that, occasionally we do have to pick things. And to your point, it may not be best. It may be just better. It may not even be better in some cases. It may be good enough, right? But at the same time, you do have to pick on occasion. And kind of the other part of that is a lot of times we debate them for a while, right? And that's the other part is sometimes you have to table those debates to just move forward, right? To make forward progress. So that's the other component of it there.
For teams that bump into these kind of
usually when I look at things, I look for the laundry list of opportunities of ways to address a problem, and then try to figure out which one is going to best suit the team that I'm currently working with to address that, which may not be the same answer for another team, right? Just based on the experience.
Right. So for teams that bump into these things where you're not sure which set of practices to go with, or you're differentiating from someone else for some reason, look into architectural decision records. They will let you, one, declare what you're doing, link to why you're doing it, and any discussions had. And two, you can then later update what your practices are and why, and the history of those decisions by using the decision record.
Yeah, that's one thing we've done pretty good job on relative to other companies I've been at is we've been working on documentation associated with different pieces of this. I won't say we're perfect, but we're pretty good about updating the handbook around different decisions we make. And then also, we're starting to get more formalized. If you look, we have a next architecture working group. They're working on blueprints to make them more effective. As an example, is another way beyond architectural decision records. Cool. Other questions folks want to verbalize? I'm going to give it another few seconds. I know that's the awkward GitLab pause that we don't ask for, but just want to make sure if anybody has any additional questions they want to ask. All right. If no one has any additional questions, then I'm going to give everybody 5 minutes time back. And I want to thank everybody for a good group conversation and always a lively set of topics. Appreciate it, everybody. Thanks.